All right, moving on then in Rudolf Steiner to lecture number 4 of his commentary to the Gospel of Luke. And now what Steiner does in this chapter is kind of gives a recap of his mythology that leads to, by the way, in this lecture that was given in 1909, this is the first time that he ever introduced the concept. He'd been lecturing on Christianity for a while now, but this is the first time that he introduces the concept of the two Jesus boys. One sprung from the line of David's son Nathan, that's the Luke boy, and the other in the Matthew Gospel sprung from the line of Solomon, David's other son, the kingly line and the priestly line. So this is the priestly line that we're talking about here. And Steiner gives a mythology for who this Nathan boy was. Last time we saw that the shepherds had gone in and they had seen a vision in which the Buddha's Nirmanakaya, as Steiner uses the term, technically it's not correct since a Nirmanakaya is a physical manifestation of the Buddha, but nonetheless, sees the Buddha's Nirmanakaya, and this, he says, is what unites with the astral body of the Christ child. And so I do want to say, before getting into Steiner's myth here, that there is no such thing as a myth that is not true. All myths are true. That's why we have them. That's why they never die. That's why they have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. Nobody wants to forget them. There's a reason, because myths, though they may not be true in the literal sense, are nonetheless true in some way. That's why the psyche responds to them and remembers them, and generations remember them. So just because it isn't physically true doesn't mean that the myth isn't true. It's a little bit like someone, reading Paradise Lost or Faust and saying, this isn't real. I mean, Faust, come on, the way Goethe tells this could not have happened. Mephistopheles turns into a dog and follows him back to his laboratory and then pops out of him. Stuff like that doesn't happen, therefore I'm not going to read this. Only an idiot would take that attitude. Literature is a form of myth, just as well as the orally transmitted myths have been transmitted from tribes, forever. So myths they're pure gold, and the psyche just eats them up. They are food for the psyche, pure protein. So Steiner then discusses the Nathan child and how the Nathan child is a bit different because he was regarded as backwards, not particularly bright, not until they find him teaching in the temple at the age of 12. And Steiner says, okay, with regard to my model for the development of the child, every 7 years, some aspect of the subtle body is born, or a sheath covering it falls away. You have the child born, let's say 0 and to 7, then the etheric body is still covered by a sheath because it's working very hard on developing the physical body. Then around the change of the teeth at the age of 7, then it is born. The sheath falls away and the etheric body now is available for other things, such as learning how to read and write and so forth, up until the age of 14, where the sheath covering the astral body falls away, and then the astral body now kicks in with the sex drive and the hormones and all of that kind of thing. 7 years later, there's another change with the sentient soul coming in, then the intellectual soul 7 years after that, then the consciousness soul 7 years after that, and so on. So this is Steiner's life cycle, and he says that now the Nathan boy was only 12, he wasn't 14. His astral body had matured a couple of years earlier, and sometimes it does that in some individuals. And so the sheath had fallen away, and the sheath covering the astral body is actually what then unites with the Nirmanakaya of the Buddha. This is a particularly warm, loving child, so he was perfectly receptive to receiving the tradition of Buddhism, which is a religion based on compassion and love. And it was a need at this point, 600 years later, of rejuvenation. And so it's very important that this child is not only a child psychologically young, but also a child that has not had many incarnations, indeed, as we'll see, if any at all. And Steiner says you could do an experiment, and this is not something we would ever do to a child. Such things have to be left up to the gods, whereby if a particularly creative child, one who is precocious in terms of creativity, is spotted, we could do a thing where we didn't teach him the subjects that other children start learning how to read and write around 6, 7, not up until around the age of 11 or 12 would we then start educating him and teaching him these other subjects, which he would most likely then pick up pretty quickly. But during that time, he would be exposed to play. He would be spending all of his time playing. And Steiner says this sometimes happens with particularly creative individuals who, as a child, do badly in school, as I myself did, for instance. I was terrible. I was always getting bad grades all through school, all the way up until college. School didn't do it for me. I got all my learning through popular culture, movies, popular drugstore paperbacks, comic books. That's how I learned about myth. I didn't know that I was getting an education about myths, but that's how it happened. And I didn't start becoming serious in my studies until college. So certain individuals, Steiner says, we would never do this to a child. In actuality, you always want to start teaching them to read and write right about the age of 6. But such things would be left up to the gods. And in this case with the Nathan boy, he was probably not very well educated at all. And hence the surprise of the parents when they find him at 12 lecturing to rabbis in the temple, in the synagogue, not the temple, the synagogue. So the background now. So Steiner goes back over his mythology again, and he says, all right, so we have these epochs preceding the earth. There are 4 epochs. 3 of them are astral. The events of the first 3 take place on the astral plane only. They would not be available to the senses. Only the 4th, the earth, the so-called earth phase, is the phase when we would have our scientific evolution, the Laplace origins of the solar system and the separation out of the planets from the same dust cloud from whence the sun is born. So the planets did, in a certain sense, break off from the sun. They all came out of the same dust cloud. But the previous epochs, we have old Saturn, in which the rudiments of the physical body were worked out. These little warmth eggs that were the earliest forms of the human beings. And then during old Sun, the etheric body comes into being. And then during old Moon, the astral body comes into being, so that the physical body doesn't solidify, even though a subtle version of it, of the physical body, has already been in presence for a long time. But it doesn't solidify until the earth phase, and everything begins to solidify and be visible to the senses. So that's the earth phase. And he says, so we have the Lemurian epoch that precedes the Atlantean epoch. And there really wasn't a sense of ego until the Atlantean epoch, so that the beings in Lemuria, there was a problem. Until the earth withdrew, until the moon withdrew from the earth, there was a problem that souls were having when they were trying to reincarnate, because bodies were stiffening. There was too strong of a mineralogical force that was too strong for the etheric life force to get into these bodies. The bodies were stiffening and hardening and becoming less and less pliable. And only the stronger souls, and he says Adam and Eve was a primordial pair who were particularly strong, tough souls, and were able to incarnate into bodies that were not as pliable. Other souls, weaker souls who could not incarnate into bodies at this time, then drifted off to the other planets, to Mercury, to Venus, to Saturn, to Jupiter. And so until the moon then withdrew from the earth. And once the moon withdrew from the earth, then it took with it calcifying, stiffening, hardening forces that then allowed the body to soften up again and become pliable for souls now streaming down from those planets to incarnate within them. And so with regard then to Adam and Eve, he says that he has this idea that Lucifer, he has this primordial opposition between these two mythical creatures that he invents called Lucifer and Araman. Araman is always the god who tempts human beings toward thinking and believing that materialism is the only thing that matters. So anytime we get materialist anything, or the working of machines and tools, that's the influence of Araman. Lucifer, on the other hand, has to do with the temptation toward pride and the human being thinking that it's so spiritual that it can rebel against higher spiritual beings, and it can even tempt the human being into believing that spirituality is the only thing that's real and the physical world is an illusion. So for him, Satan is Lucifer, and this is the being who tempted Adam and Eve toward the knowledge of good and evil. They ate from that tree and had the knowledge of good and evil, but the tree of immortal life was forbidden to them. And he says that now a certain part of Adam's etheric body was preserved, a certain part of it that was guiltless and was not stained with the sin of the disobedience of the giving in to the temptations of the Luciferic spirit, which caused a rebellion, a sort of cosmic war in heaven. And so this part of the etheric body of Adam never reincarnated until it reached this Nathan boy. And in a sense, then the Nathan boy had a young soul and incarnate. So this part of Adam incarnated into him then as a provisional ego. Now, this boy goes through 3 different egos. So we find out that he has the ego of Adam to get up to the age of 12. And then at 12, the Solomon boy dies, who had been the reincarnation of Zarathustra. Zarathustra's ego then goes in and displaces this Adam ego at 12. And then at 30, the Christ ego comes down and displaces the Zarathustra ego. So this poor boy, I'm not sure Steiner is aware of what he's putting the Nathan boy through. But anyhow, so we have the Adam ego, which is never incarnated after Adam, into this boy. And the reason that the boy has to have a young ego is because Zarathustra now was a very old soul. Even in his own time, 6000 BC, was a very old soul, had gone through many, many incarnations in India during the first post-Atlantean epoch, and was already very old, even though extremely developed and wise. Nonetheless, it was old, and he required a physical body with a soul in it that was young to rejuvenate it, as did the Buddha also. And so this is why Zarathustra then incarnates into the Solomon boy, who is raised by a set of parents in Bethlehem, known as Joseph and Mary. And then the Nathan boy is from Nazareth and is raised by another set of parents named Joseph and Mary. And Steiner says that these were common names at the time, so okay, we'll grant you that they were common names. One had a large family though, and one didn't. So this is the mythology of the Nathan boy. So it's very interesting actually that this is why, in the words of Paul, this is the new Adam. The old Adam is the Adam who fell prey to the original sin, but Christ is the new Adam, and Paul was a friend of Luke. So Luke would have inherited this doctrine of the Nathan boy as the new Adam in a quite literal sense. He has Adam's a piece of his etheric body in him as a provisional ego up until the age of 12. And so this is why this boy had to be specially prepared to be a young soul, because Zarathustra was an old soul and he required a young soul to pair with and join into his body. And then he inherits the Nirmanakaya from the Buddha, which then unites with his astral body. And now he's all set to go. So here we are. And then we'll continue with Steiner's mythology the next time. And this is the first time, keep in mind, that he's introducing to his audiences, in 1909, this concept of the 2 separate Jesus boys. It's fun. I doubt that it's true. But there again, it doesn't matter, as we started out saying, all myths are true. There's no such thing as a myth that isn't true. Just because it's not true to the physical senses doesn't make it not true. They're all true. They all have something to teach and tell us. That's why we preserve them. Okay, so we'll leave it there.